So it's been a couple weeks since the finale of Arcane, and I have mixed feelings. My personal thoughts aren't the only thing that's been divided, though. It's no secret that fans of League's lore and universe have been somewhat split as well. You can make the argument that this has been true since Season 1, but Season 2 of Riot's new hit series has only widened the gap. We're at a point where people generally fall into one of three camps. You're either a fan of the pre-existing Runeterra, a fan of Arcane, or somewhere in the middle. If you've somehow missed all the discourse, though, allow me to give you a brief rundown. A little over 10 years ago, Riot Games rebooted the story of their flagship title, League of Legends, in an effort to tidy up some contradictions and free themselves of the restrictions that came with trying to create a fictional universe tied to a MOBA, a genre that doesn't exactly lend itself well to a long-running narrative. They started exploring various avenues with which to tell these tales, be they written stories on the website, visual novels, indie games, an online card game, comics, and even published novels. While not all of these stories were super well received, the world that Riot's writers had established developed an entire fan base unto itself. People cared a great deal about the characters and the various factions that inhabited it. People fell in love with the intricate world building and power systems Riot set in place. You may only care about a specific region or a particular cast of characters, or you may enjoy all of it. There were some slight inconsistencies here and there, sure, but nothing that necessarily broke the narrative. Of course, all the while, Arcane was in development for about 6 years following Riot's initial reboot. If you're just a fan of the show and have or had no prior knowledge of Runeterra beforehand, then you might think it's a fantastic jumping on point to try to get into it. If you're a long-time fan of League's lore, however, you need no lecture about how Arcane's world building and the events of its narrative heavily contradict the pre-established story of Runeterra. Many came to disregard Arcane as more of a side story or alternate universe, as a means of reconciling the inconsistencies. But Riot themselves did not. A somewhat well-known YouTuber by the name of TB Skyn has already made a video breaking down the issues of trying to fit Arcane into League's existing timeline post-Season 1. And following Season 2, I can safely say that this is more or less impossible. In spite of that, Riot seems determined to try. They've already completely overhauled Victor to match his appearance in Arcane, and have hinted at trying to do the same with other champions going forward. Hell, their output of stories has ground to a complete halt these last few years, under the pretense of ensuring that everything aligns perfectly into a single narrative, when they really should have been making that a priority much sooner if they really cared about everything making sense. This has led to a plethora of debate among the fandom regarding what is or even should be canon to Runeterra's narrative. Some people loathe the show and the various iterations it made to certain characters' stories and relationships, while others only care about the show and are fully on board with following the Netflix storyline of Runeterra going forward. Whatever camp you fall into, though, trying to say that these two storylines are one and the same is, to put it bluntly, a monumentally stupid idea. Look, I like Arcane. I'll even say that I prefer some Arcane iterations of champions over the originals. However, despite Riot's promises that they're going to try to make one coherent timeline without retconning anything, that is, again, just fundamentally impossible. Like, by the end of the show, at least 2 champions are dead, including the one they literally just added to the game. 2 have screwed off into the multiverse, I guess, and several characters are now permanently disfigured in ways that contradict their appearance in other media. On top of all of that, there are many champions that literally cannot exist anymore because the events of the show directly go against their entire premise. Like, if you were a fan of Camille, Blitzcrank, or Seraphine, sorry, Hextech is basically gone now, and so are they. Renata, Mundo, and Zeri shouldn't exist either, since their stories revolve around Zon being a lower class, which doesn't work anymore because Piltover now has Zonite counselors. Look, if you're an Arcane-only fan who doesn't know or care about the broader League mythos, Maybe this isn't a big deal to you. If you only know the show's versions of these characters and have no idea who the rest of these weirdos even are, their existence might not even be a concern. So, here, let me give you an analogy. Imagine if Marvel, during the height of the MCU's popularity, decided to retcon all of their comics to make everything fit with the movie's continuity. Imagine generations of stories and characters that comic fans have grown up with were suddenly retconned to oblivion. Imagine an entire decades old fandom being screwed over because Marvel now wants to focus their entire brand around the one project that just happened to hit it big with a mainstream audience. Oh, wait, you don't actually have to imagine that much, because Marvel has made various changes to their stories to make characters like their MCU counterparts. But even then, the comics and movies are still acknowledged as their own separate things. At the very least, any changes made to the characters to better fit their MCU versions are regarded as just a progression of what came before, rather than flat out erasing it. I mean, if Arcane was meant to be a jumping on point for people to get into the broader League narrative, then it has backfired considerably. Even if Riot eventually gets around to overhauling the backstories of every Zontover champion to fit the new narrative, which I doubt they will because they never even finished their first major reboot, there are simply too many inconsistencies. Keep in mind, the ripple effects of this show apply to the rest of the world too. Like, Singed being a sad dad who just wants to revive his daughter, rather than an amoral madman who commits war crimes purely to satisfy his own scientific curiosities, means we now have to completely retcon his involvement in the Noxian invasion of Ionia and everything that resulted in it. Hextech being removed as a cornerstone of Piltovan society means that they probably aren't invading Kumungu jungles to mine for hex crystals, which kind of screws over Kiana's entire narrative. Like, it would be fine if they just said Arcane was its own universe, since alternate timelines have been a thing since Echo was introduced, and even the show toys around with that idea. But then they decided to make Victor's Arcane appearance a VGU, rather than an alt skin like the other characters. Now, there's been a whole lot of back and forth in the community about this as well, whether new Victor is an improvement or if he just misses the point. But I think the debate is somewhat irrelevant at the end of the day, because the fact of the matter is, Victor no longer exists, like in any form. Old Vic has been retconned out of existence, and New Vic, as we've established, gave up at the end of the show to do some kind of cosmic mind meld with Jace. Or what? Are we supposed to believe he crossed over into the main timeline and just instantly reverted to crazy magic messiah man right after his big redemptive moment? Look, I'm not trying to say that Arcane is bad. Far from it. I'm not saying you're wrong for liking it or for preferring the show's interpretation of these characters to the game. All I'm trying to do is express how frustrating the situation is for longtime lore fans like myself. It just makes everything feel so meaningless, you know? Like, why should I even bother to get invested in this universe, these characters, or the stories they're involved in, if Riot is just going to scrap everything they've spent years building up because they happen to stumble into one successful spin off project after fumbling the ball with like a dozen others? And yes, I am somewhat aware of the irony. League has been reinventing its own characters and stories for years at this point. That's the entire point of VGUs and to an extent ASUs. We've seen older champions replaced with new iterations of themselves dozens of times now. But at least with them, it felt like we were going somewhere. It felt like a vision was taking shape, even if you may not necessarily always agree with it. Now, Riot is backpedaling on so much of what they built up for a project they, frankly speaking, will probably never finish. Again. And all things considered, this likely won't be the last time either. Chances are that in a couple years they'll start retconning Arcane to fit the story of some new project. Maybe that MMO they're allegedly working on, assuming it's still in development. Have fun exploring Piltover with your avatar characters and wondering why Hextech is back even though it nearly caused an apocalypse. So yeah, League's canon is a mess, and I frankly doubt Riot is ever going to properly be able to fix it. In other words, Who even really cares what they say at this point? As far as I'm concerned, we as fans are more than free to pick and choose what aspects of the canon we enjoy, regardless of what the corporate overlords declare to be official. Was Vi raised by Vander with her sister, or did she grow up alone in the Hope House orphanage? Is Victor a wannabe metal messiah or cyborg transhumanist? Is Oriana the daughter of Singed or Corin Revik? You decide. I realize that might sound like a bit of an anticlimactic solution, but I honestly think it's the only real option we as a community have at this point. I mean, if the alternative is endlessly warring amongst ourselves over what's canon and what's not in a universe that's constantly retconning itself anyways, then yeah. I think the only thing we can do is accept that we all have our own ideas of what Runeterra should be, and leave it at that.